want a bear mace? I'll just walk right through it. That paintball gun won't stop me. I'll still continue following you through this town until you leave. Go home. We do this every night. On August 15th, 2020, journalist Jason Britton yelled those exact words at Alan Swinney and his group of demonstrators. We do this every night. Our story begins against the backdrop of months of nightly Black Lives Matter protests against police. After several months, pro-police groups began demonstrating to show their support of the police. Specifically, 2 incidents and demonstrations on August 15, 2020 and August 22nd, 2020. Both of those demonstrations, Alan Swinney attended. Those demonstrations were flag-waving events. Both events took place midday at a time when Black Lives Matter events were not occurring. Black Lives Matter events, protests, were still occurring at night at that point. The pro-police groups chose to demonstrate in front of the Portland Police Bureau precinct, symbolizing their position. On August 15th, 2020, Alan Swinney and his group came down to Portland, downtown, to demonstrate and show their support for the Portland Police Bureau. They arrived and had flags and were standing in front of Central Precinct with flags. At some point, protesters who are against, who oppose the police and oppose people who support the police, showed up, began to verbally harass Mr. Swinney and his group, got in their faces, yelled at them. This went on for a bit. At some point, the flag wavers decided to call it a day. They wrapped up their flags, packed up their stuff, and began the walk to the parking garage. Rather than taking a direct route, they took a circuitous route to the parking garage. And they took a circuitous route to the parking garage because when Alan and his group started walking, they noticed that someone was following. It was a group of protesters, the same group that moments earlier had been verbally harassing Mr. Swinney and his group. So they took the long way back to the parking garage. Various times during that walk, Alan turned around and said, "Stop following us." He asked the protesters to stop following him and his group. The protesters continued to follow him. Early on in that walk, Alan even turned to his colleague and said, "We got to get out of here." At one point, noticing protesters were getting closer to him, Alan asked yet again for those protesters to stop following him and get back. Those protesters did not stop following. 2 individuals in particular were close to Mr. Swinney, and Mr. Swinney sprayed mace towards one protester and shot his paintball gun at the gas mask of another protester. These acts form the basis of count 1, attempted assault in the 4th degree, count 2, unlawful use of mace in the 2nd degree, and count 3, attempted assault in the 2nd degree. Allen was defending himself. Later, various camera angles will show an African-American man in a white t-shirt and a gas mask sneaking up behind Allen and his group and loudly clapping aggressively behind them. Another protester walked by with a collapsible baton. This group of protesters continued to menace and aggressively encroach on Allen and his group. As Mr. Swinney's group rounded the corner of Yamhill Street in Southwest 3rd, Mr. Britton, journalist Britton, continued to follow, film, and verbally harass Allen. Notwithstanding Mr. Britton's vociferously yelling at Allen, Allen largely ignored Mr. Britton. Mr. Britton retorts, "I'll see you in court, buddy." Mr. Swinney stops, turns around, and points his paintball gun, not at Jason Britton, and says, "Back, back, back." Out of the corner of the screen of the video, a head emerges. It's the same guy, the guy in the white t-shirt and gas mask who had previously been loudly clapping behind Allen and his group. At that point, that man was coming closer towards Allen. And Allen fired his paintball gun at that individual, that protester in a gas mask. When he began firing his paintball gun at that person in the gas mask, that person moved out of the way, and Mr. Britton, who was standing near that person, was shot with a paintball gun. Paintball was struck with a paintball. Allen Swinney did not fire his paintball gun at Jason Britton. He used his paintball gun to defend himself. August 22nd began much the same way that August 15th had, but things began to heat up quickly. On August 22nd, a group called Back the Blue had organized a flag waving event in downtown Portland, again, in the middle of the day. The Back the Blue flag wavers had lined up in front of the Justice Center, in front of 3rd Avenue, and were waving their flags. Protesters arrived downtown and staged themselves on the edge of Chapman Park, directly across from the Back the Blue flag waving event that had been occurring. At some point, Allen Swinney and members of his group came in and formed a human wall to protect the flag wavers. Allen was a target, very tall, dressed in body armor, has a paintball gun and mace, among other items. Allen was a target, as evidenced by the various substances caked on his helmet face shield. At some point, Megan Stewart was walking through Chapman Park behind a wall of protesters. As she moved behind that crowd, Miss Stewart had her phone out and was actively filming the scene. While filming, she remarks that she was shot with a paintball. This is heard on the video that she filmed. Aside from Alan, several other people that day had paintball guns on both sides. Both groups had paintball guns. Alan's own black vest was stained with bright pink and green paintball strikes. Back on 3rd Avenue, things between the groups had become more aggressive. The protesters were throwing projectiles. Tink, tink, tink. Mr. Swinney, in the middle of it all, pulled out his revolver and pointed it towards the projectiles and yelled, "Hey, hey!" Immediately, the protesters stopped throwing things. And Alan put his revolver back in his holster and walked away. Alan Swinney did not fire that gun that day. At the end of the trial, after reviewing all the evidence, we will come here before you and ask you to return a not guilty verdict on all counts, because that is what the evidence will show. Thank you.